Makes a huge difference if you'll do me a favor by subscribing and liking the podcast wherever you listen. It goes a long way. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy. To kill democracy, to control the masses and destroy entire nations, dictators have always used the same secret weapon, the unmatched power of the spoken word. In this podcast, I talk with Guy Doza, a Cambridge speechwriter, about his newest book, The Language of Evil. We discuss this topic of how words, rhetoric, language can be used for good or evil and to control people and make them feel powerless. Great conversation. Check out his book where books are sold, The Language of Evil by Guy Doza, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Welcome, Guy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Diving into rhetoric, into language. Like when you were a little kid, were you fascinated with the way we use language?
I was always fascinated with the way that we use language since I was a little kid. And I think it came about from the fact that, if I'm being completely honest, I was just rubbish at English in school. I was so bad at English. And I would have all these ideas and I could never get them down on paper because I later found out I had dyslexia. So I was actually not that good at writing, but I'd have all of the ideas. And I realized at a certain point in my education, I got invited to go to a debate club. And I thought, wow, here's a way that I can engage with the English language where spelling, punctuation, and grammar don't count. And it was amazing. It was so empowering. And from that moment, when I was a kid, I was obsessed with speeches, how speeches work, how we use speeches, the impact they have on audiences, and how speeches are different to every other type of writing that we normally do. And I think that for me as a kid was the most interesting thing. And then when I was at university in my second year, I did a module on logic and rhetoric. This was at Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London. It was run by this fantastic professor called Jonathan Powell. And I realized, wow, all of these things that we do when we're saying, there are rules, there are techniques that have been well documented throughout history that are used again and again. And all I have to do is learn how to apply them to my writing. And I was absolutely fascinated in how rhetoric overlapped with public speaking and oratory. And I then started going to the British Parliament, to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, to listen to speeches, to network. And eventually, after having spoken to enough people, I said to someone, "Oh, I'm a student, a master's student. I'm researching rhetoric in political discourse. I'm very interested in speech writing." Someone asked me if I could help them with a speech, and then from then on, I was a speechwriter. And that's
So, how old were you when that speech and debate happened? Were you in high school age or?
Yeah, I was in high school. I was in high school, so I'd be maybe like 14 years old, 13, 14 years old. And I loved my school. I loved learning. It's just I couldn't really get things on paper in the way that other people could. Obviously, now with years of practicing, university, lots of lessons, my writing is almost typo free. I still have this bit of imposter syndrome when I'm in a very important boardroom and the CEO's there and lots of very important people and I'm writing something on a document is being live projected onto a big screen. I do get a bit of imposter syndrome, but it's fine.
How do you deal with that in the moment?
What do you mean that in the moment?
Like when you get that imposter syndrome that's being broadcast right there, like how do you emotionally handle that feeling in the moment?
I think you just have to take whatever challenge it is that you faced and use it as a tool for empowerment. I think to myself, well, I'm here because I think differently about the way language works, and that's why these really important people who are very good at writing and never have typos and got top grades at school employ me to be in the room. And I have a purpose here, and I approach these problems slightly differently, and I find that to be incredibly helpful. And it's just part of who I am, how I communicate, but it's a different form of communication. I run lots of rhetoric workshops and academies, and also speechwriting courses for various different speechwriters. And it's interesting because I get people who are very good writers. They've been working as journalists since I was 5 years old, as was in one case. Someone has just been a journalist for almost all of my life and has always been writing for the eye, but never for the ear. And obviously they're very different. They're very different senses. And when you're writing a speech, you're writing for the ear, not for the eye. So we change the way we do it. And of course, I've written articles, I've written op-eds, I've written books. So, I can adapt my writing style. But a lot of people really struggle to write speeches because it's something that's delivered orally. So it's completely different to when someone's reading. And it's something that has to be understood by a listener, not by a reader.
What are the differences that you've learned and the nuances, like if we can dive into that you think make a difference?
So if you're writing an article and you're using grammatically correct sentence and clause structures, you'll find that you end up having quite long sentences. And sometimes the long sentences can convey more complicated messages in a higher, at a higher level. It's not necessarily the way things work in speech. And there's a very good quote. I think it was originally from Voltaire or something, but I heard it from this guy called Peter Botting, who's also great. And he said, "Big ideas don't need big words," and that was the message. And I think that when we're looking at public speaking, at speeches, the shorter the sentences, the more effective what you're saying is going to be, because the easier it is for the audience to understand, and the more likely it is to have an impact, especially if it's an emotional impact, than if you were writing in a persuasive article or an op-ed or content for social media or something. So the writing style changes with regards to sentence length, the repetitions, for example. There are certain repetitions that when you use them spoken, they sound really powerful, but when you're reading them, they sound really cheesy. And also vice versa. So there's some things that work really well for a reader, but will not work really well when delivered orally. But also you have to remember that changes based on who's saying it. If I'm writing something, I'd be like, oh, this is really powerful, but actually it doesn't work with that one speaker's voice, or the way that speaker understands grammar means that they don't get into the pace of things. It's especially the case with international speakers for whom English isn't the first language, because they have a different grammatical structure that they grew up with, and where they place emphasis in a sentence can be different to where we place emphasis in English. And obviously it also varies, from, UK British English to US American English. It can also change a little bit. So a big part of what I do as a speechwriter is trying to understand I ask myself, what's the message and the objective that this person has? What do they want to achieve as a result of this speaking opportunity? And then what are the words that will make it happen for that speaker in that moment with that audience.
Have you studied some of the most popular speeches of all time? What's your thoughts on that? I think of Martin Luther King Jr., "I Have a Dream," or things like that in the U.S. that we go back to, we learn in school and we revisit.
Yeah, I have in my first book, which is called How to Apologize for Killing a Cat, Rhetoric and the Art of Persuasion. I basically introduce the reader to various different rhetorical tropes and techniques. And then I give examples, some from historical speeches that are really famous that we study in school. So Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" is in there, the Gettysburg Address is in there, but also examples from popular fiction, from movies, from books, from politicians, from all areas of life. Because my message is that rhetoric is universal. It's absolutely everywhere. It doesn't matter where you look. It doesn't matter whether it's on X. It doesn't matter if it's in an 18th century novel. It doesn't matter if it's in a speech given by a man or a woman. It doesn't matter their ethnicity, what part of the world they're from, what time period they're from. These patterns are universal. Everyone always uses them. There are certain patterns of repetition that create a rhythm that's perhaps it's just in tune with the human condition. We respond better when we hear them. And rhetoric is, for me, it's about applying these schemes and tropes. So I say schemes and tropes, I should probably explain what that means. It basically means you have a set of rules that you follow. So, for example, you can have, Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream," and he repeated, "I have a dream" at the beginning of consecutive clauses, sentences, and also points. And that's something that many people know this from school, some people might not. It's called an anaphora or anaphoric repetition. But it's simply repeating something at the beginning of your sentences. And it's incredibly powerful because if you're in a speech, it kind of almost hypnotizes the audience, putting them into this kind of trance. You say, "I have a dream where," and then you project a vision that's very emotional that they can connect with, and the audience feels something. And when the audience feels something, you're more likely to then get them to feel the same thing, like a level up. And when people are emotional, that's when you're most likely to change their views or change the way that they live their lives, or the people they interact with, or the people they vote for, or what they do with their money, whatever it is. You get an awful lot of anaphora in pretty much every speech. There's the opposite of anaphora, which is called epistrophe. So that's repetition at the end of a sentence, paragraph or clause. An example I use is the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. He said, I think it was, "To the mothers and the fathers, we say sorry. To the brothers and the sisters, we say sorry. For the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry." So he repeated "we say sorry" at the end. And the context of that speech is he was apologising to the indigenous peoples of Australia who underwent horrific things under the past Australian government. But it's, and you can, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, you can look at these patterns and you can think, okay, so here's an Australian politician speaking within our lifetime. Here's a US politician speaking a few hundred years ago. But then you can take it to the extreme. You can say, okay, well, now let's go to China 1,000 years ago and see what people are saying. And then you think, okay, well, now let's go to the ancient world and let's see what Julius Caesar was saying. What did Cicero say? What did Goebbels say in his Total War speech? And one of the things that's really interesting is the same patterns used again and again and again. And audiences fall for the same techniques again and again and again. And sometimes that message can be really positive. It has a great impact in the world. And sometimes it can be absolutely abhorrent, like one of the worst messages you could ever give, but they work because they're delivered in a certain way, certain style, using this, this ancient art of rhetoric that's been around for thousands of years. But people don't realize it's happening. I gave a talk about rhetoric and I called it Defense Against the Dark Arts, because it is kind of like this dark art. And we need to learn about it, because otherwise, we're going to go there and we're just going to be exploited by everyone. I mean, the car mechanic who's making up terms to try and confuse you. This is a rhetorical feature. It's called periphrasis. So periphrasis is when you use unnecessarily complicated language in order to confuse the person you're talking to, so they're less likely to know how to respond. So I don't know if you've ever had this experience where maybe it's someone who's doing something mechanical, and if you don't know anything about, for example, how to fix a car, the person can then just use all sorts of terms that you don't know. You feel a bit silly, and then you say, okay, yeah, sure, I'll pay to fix it, without even knowing what it is.
Right.
And that's periphrasis. And politicians use it a lot. Academics love it. I give lots of lectures. I'm a guest lecturer quite often at various different universities. If a student asks me a particularly challenging question, I don't always, but I may choose to respond using lots of unnecessarily convoluted academic language in order to, assert my academic status, but also hopefully confuse them so they don't come up with the following question. I'm telling you all the secrets. So if there are any undergraduate students who may one day be in my lecture and you've listened to this.
Right. My dad is a doctor, retired doctor, and even still, I give him a hard time because he'll say, like a couple months ago, he was talking to my nephew and he was using the medical jargon, and my nephew's completely lost. And I said to my nephew in front of my dad, I was like, "You mean the elbow?" You don't have that, I was like, come on, he'll say like myocardial infarction. I'm like, come on, heart attack,
But it depends what your objective is. If your objective is to be understood, you say heart attack. If your objective is to try and seem clever or intimidating, then you say whatever the other one was.
Yes.
But yeah, it's and that's the great thing about rhetoric. It's how you use it with intention. Like, what's the intention? What's the objective of the rhetoric that you're using? But yeah, that's a great example.
And do you think that applies in everyday language? Like when we're communicating, we're having a conversation. Sometimes we overcomplicate it so the message, the impact, the persuasion, the influence gets watered down, gets drowned out.
I mean, I think some people probably do it intentionally, some people do it unintentionally. But I do think that, again, this is a question where you have to judge your audience. If you're speaking to an audience that's highly educated, that's going to be very critical, an audience who's just had a very strong cup of coffee, you can speak at a much different pace than if you're talking to the same audience before they've had coffee and they're all really tired in the morning, for example. No, I'm being serious. If you've just, let's say you're at a very important conference and the fire alarm's gone off at 3 a.m. and you have to stand outside and make an announcement, the nature of the discourse is going to change, isn't it? Because you can't speak in the same way. You can't speak in the same style because the setting affects everything. So yeah, it's and then there are lots of people who use periphrases unintentionally, or it comes across the wrong way. It's ironic, isn't it? Because I'm here so casually saying, oh, people use periphrasis. But if I didn't explain what it meant and I was just talking about periphrasis, I imagine loads of listeners would be like, what does that mean? And it's quite confusing. And it's ironic that that's how complicated sounding the word for this technique is, of when you intentionally want to sound complicated and fancy.
You talked about, like, say, politicians or leaders have been using these rules for thousands of years, and it works so well in different countries, cultures, environments, contexts. And it's how come it works so well for influencing or manipulating, depending upon the objective for the audience who's listening? How come it works so well?
So we're primal by nature, and we like feeling emotions. Emotions are incredibly cathartic things. And if you're in a room and a speaker says something, especially if that speaker is demonstrating the emotion, if I'm in a room and the room is, let's say, jam packed, so you're stood up next to people, not sat down, not watching virtually, but you're physically in a space, and an audience and a speaker, let's say, gets angry with the message that they're delivering, I feel that injustice, and then I start getting angry, and I can see other people around me getting angry, and then emotions travel like wildfire. They reverberate off of the audience. They bounce off of the walls and we all start feeling it. And I know this because I've been in situations where, through my work, I've been listening to political speeches about topics that maybe I don't agree with. In some cases, topics I genuinely don't care about. But the speaker has done such a good job of making it a raw display of emotions that I found myself wanting to support them, even though this isn't me. I don't care about whatever local issue in Scotland this is about. It happened to be once a Scottish speaker, absolutely fantastic, gave a roaring speech. And I was in the room and I was like, yeah, it's really important that we actually have more funding for this specific police department. And I thought, well, this isn't where I live. This isn't my policing department. Yet they've just given such a passionate speech about it that I found myself getting carried away with the emotions. Now, imagine if it's something that I did believe, that I thought was very important, and I was in a room full of people who also believed it. And let's say we perhaps couldn't articulate our thoughts, and the speaker goes up and articulates that idea with passion, we catch that passion. And once we're emotional and we're passionate, we don't use our critical thinking or our reasoning. And audiences get swept away because I say there's this idea of pathos. So pathos is emotional language. And then we have logos, which is logic. But pathos is so powerful that all logical reasoning goes out the window. You can tell people, don't kill, killing is wrong. And we were raised our whole lives being told killing is wrong. Yet there have been situations where speakers have stood up in front of crowds and convinced them that it's right to kill a certain group of people, or it's right to take up arms and die for your country. And many people in that audience would have probably never thought they would have felt that way before. And that feeling is new to them. And they get almost like carried away with that emotion. And that's when it gets terrifying. And some of the speeches I looked at in my second book, The Language of Evil, are speeches where the speakers have told the people in the audience that we're going to go to war and I want you to die. How can you give a speech like that? I mean, the most terrifying example, I do you want examples or?
Yeah, please.
The most terrifying example is actually Eva Peron. So she was the wife of Juan Peron. Eva Peron was people know her because of the musical, but actually she was a very powerful public speaker. Her husband was a dictator of Argentina, absolutely awful individual. And all she would do is go around and give speeches in support of her husband. And one of the last speeches she gave is filled with emotion. It's so powerful. She'd just been diagnosed with cancer. So she was dying and people saw that she was unwell, and then rumors broke out, and then she confirmed that she had cancer, and she was given this honorary award from the state. And she gave a speech on Loyalty Day, which is like a big deal at the time. It still is, but a big deal at the time. And she went on a balcony and everyone knew she was dying. So everyone was already feeling a little bit emotional. And she said that her doctors told her not to be there, that she might die. And she said, but that's okay. She said, I'm happy to die for the people. I'm happy to die for the people because you're the most important thing that I have. I'm happy to die for my husband because he's the most important thing that I have. And she has this metaphor about how her life is, as she's going ahead, she's leaving shreds of her life behind her. And she tells the people, I want you to pick up those shreds of my life and I want you to hold them up as a victory banner as you march into battle against the enemy. And, but there was no enemy. Argentina wasn't at war. There was no enemy. It was like a mysterious hidden political enemy in our midst. She made it up. And then I'm going to see if I can find I think I may have bookmarked it. And then she gives this thing and she talks about her dying. And she says this, and I think this is terrifying. She says, the enemies of the people of Peron and the fatherland have long known that Peron and Eva Peron are ready to die for this people. Now they know that this people are ready to die for Peron. So she says to the audience, now our enemies know that you're willing to die for my husband, for our political leader, not for your country, not for an ideology, but for Peron. And she went on to say, compañeros, which means like comrades, I ask just one thing today, that all of us publicly vow to defend Peron and to fight for him until death. And our oath shall be shouted for a minute so that our cry can reach the last corner of the earth. Our lives for Peron. And the audience went mad. And they all started chanting, our lives for Peron. And she had hypnotized her audience into chanting about wanting to die for their political leader when there was no war. There was no enemy troops at the gate. Yet here they were, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets chanting about wanting to die for their leader. How is that possible? And it's because she toyed with their emotions and she twisted that into this political weapon that she then gave to her husband. And it's incredibly powerful stuff. Another example of something like this is actually, and this is a much more sinister example perhaps, it was a speech given by, I've already mentioned, by Goebbels after the Battle of Stalingrad. So in the Second World War, the Nazis were fighting on multiple fronts, and the Nazi propaganda machine would lie about everything. They'd always say, it's going really great, it's going good, it's going great, it's going great. But eventually, the German people realized actually it's not going great, and the Battle of Stalingrad was such a defeat that the Nazis could no longer hide it. And I think this was the first time in the history of the war that the Nazis admitted they had lost something. Because he had, I think it was the Sixth Army, the German Sixth Army, and that was like the star of the German army, and it was completely annihilated in the Battle of Stalingrad. It was gone, And morale was on the floor. Like all of German morale was on the floor, according to the history books. And then in 1 hour and 54 minutes, with this speech, Joseph Goebbels managed to completely re-energize the entire nation. Bonkers. And you can listen to the audio. So what they did, and they specifically wanted people who were going to be supporters. So they hand selected 14,000 people, and they took them to the largest indoor space they had in Berlin. And every person who was selected because they were sympathetic to the Nazi party. They had teachers, they had cobblers, they had butchers, they had all different professions, because this was the people. That was what the narrative they wanted to project. And Goebbels had to make some concessions. It's called concessio in Latin, where you admit defeat, but then you try and turn that round. And he said the reason that we've gotten to the stage is because we were fighting the old way and the Russians were giving it all out war. And he says to the audience, maybe it's time we show them our total war. And he basically tells the audience, we still have this one last push in us. And you can see how, as he's giving the speech, he gets angrier, the audience gets angry. He talks about the injustices they faced. He talks about, injustices from the First World War. He talks all this, slanderous lies about, the Jewish people of Europe, about the people of Britain, and how it's you, the specific individuals in this room, who have been damaged by this. And people get angrier and angrier. And he riles them up. And if you listen to the audio, if you read the transcript says, the minister cannot be heard because of the applause. And if you listen to the audio, you realize what that means. There's monstrous applause in the room. And the very end, and this I think is terrifying, the very last thing he says is, now people rise up and let the storm break loose. So he literally says to them, he's got this imperative. So it's telling the audience what to do, rise up and let the storm break loose. It's using this metaphor about the power of nature, because storms very powerful thing. And it's also right at the end of his speech. Now, this is something that I think is really interesting. And I'm actually going to go away from real speeches and look at fictional speech. But if you look at William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, there's a scene where Mark Antony gives the same speech. He gets an audience who's not ready for war, and he convinces them to go to war, and he riles them up and he plays with their emotions. And he says at the end, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. So again, he's ended with an imperative. He's invoked natural imagery in this idea of these mighty, dogs about to be let off. And it was right at the end of his speech. And you think, how is it possible that this fictional villain in a play and this real villain in Nazi Germany just ended their speech with exactly the same techniques, used in exactly the same way, in exactly the same place? And that is the language of evil. And that's how you can really manipulate an audience. And actually, Goebbels was so proud of the speech that he gave that afterwards, and this is from someone else's diary entry, he was boasting with his friends, and he said, the audience were eating out of my hands. If I told them to jump off of the roof of the building, it was a very tall building, they would have done it. So he was joking with his friends, saying that audience would have died for no reason if I told them to, because he knew how much control he had over them because of this emotional journey that he took them, building up, using all of these rhetorical features, a lot of invoking of time. This is called kairos. You invoke the power of time. You say, you, here, today, now, never before, never throughout history. And speakers do that quite a lot. And it makes the audience feel like they're part of something momentous, and then they feel more emotional. And yeah, it's bonkers to see, here's a lady in Argentina, here's a fictional character from the early 1600s, and here's a Nazi, and they're all asking people to basically go and die for them in variations of the same way. And it doesn't matter where you look. I even managed to find, it took a lot of digging, speeches given by the Mongols under the rule of Genghis Khan, telling soldiers to go die in battle. Napoleon did the same thing, told soldiers to go and die in battle, and Attila the Hun. Everyone's given variations of this. Mussolini is I call it the let's go to war speech. But so many people have given variations of the let's go to war speech. Even in more recent history, you have speeches where people are declaring that we're going to go to war. Probably the most famous example that most listeners will know is the Axis of Evil speech given by George Bush, which is basically a declaration that war is coming. That's no way to say that it's comparable to the other speeches, but it's interesting to see how the same rhetoric of war is used again and again and again. And obviously, there are some major wars happening at the moment, and the rhetoric around them is also surprisingly or unsurprisingly quite similar. But people don't remember. They forget.
Yeah, and it works so well.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the same, why go and reinvent the wheel when the wheel is working, that pattern.
One of the things that the Nazis did is they literally said, there's this amazing thing called rhetoric. We just need to use it really methodically in all of our communications. And they knew exactly what they were doing. And they even documented how they were doing it and why they were doing it. And even, I don't know if I'll be able to find it, but even Adolf Hitler in his book Mein Kampf talks about why it's so important that you use speeches as opposed to anything else. And he says that speeches are just the most effective tool that we have available to us.
Goodness.
I think he said, I found it. So this is the quote. And then again, this is from Mein Kampf, so don't go around quoting it too much, but with context. And I tell people this, like, why should we look at evil speeches? I was like, well, we have to look at what evil people have done and how they spoke, because we want to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yes.
But this quote is, I think, terrifying. He wrote, this is again published in 1925, the knights of the pen and the literary, in translation, the knights of the pen and the literary snobs of today should be made to realize that the great transformations which have taken place in this world were never conducted by a goose quill. No, the task of the pen must always be that of presenting the theoretical concepts which motivate such changes. The force which has ever and always set in motion great historical avalanches of religious and political movements is the magic power of the spoken word. The broad masses of a population are more amenable to the appeal of rhetoric than any other force. Those are Adolf Hitler's words. He literally said, I know how we brainwash people. It's with speeches. And then that's what he did. And that's what the people closest to him did. It's terrifying, terrifying. And you know, he gave over 1,500 speeches, I think, in his political career. So I've never read hardly any of them, but the ones that I have read, you can see exactly what he's doing. And I could think, okay, well, if Aristotle, Quintilian, and Cicero are marking this, they would recognize all these techniques that they labeled and they came up with in these Nazi speeches.
So that's 100 years ago, and we have people today, right? That was 1925, or thereabouts, right? And we have people today doing the same thing, and we will in the future. So, like, how do we as a general population of the world, humans of the world, combat that?
I think, and this goes back to the jokingly called it defense against the dark arts, but this goes back to that you need to learn what rhetoric is and how rhetoric works, because then you can defend yourself from people who are trying to use it against you. Because if you don't understand the argumentative or the argumentative tactics or the tactics of logic or the tactics of emotion that people are using against you, you're going to fall for the trap and not realize it's happened. And then next thing you know, you are being radicalized, or you are the one advocating for something that you probably would have never done before you'd had this influence in your life. And I think that you need to study rhetoric. I think it needs to be taught more widely. You know, rhetoric used to be one of the cores of education for hundreds of years. And then people said, oh, rhetoric's really dangerous, so we have to stop teaching it to people. And it was seen as being this dark force that we don't want to meddle with. And as a result, you ended up with a very naive population who just fell for it again. So the question is, how do you bring it in education in a way that's going to be valuable or beneficial? I tell people that rhetoric is a tool. And like all tools, it can be used constructively or destructively. I often use the analogy of fire. You know, rhetoric is like fire. You know, fire can be used maliciously to burn things, but also you can use it to, you know, create forges and power things and create technology. You can use it to make fireworks, which are pretty to look at. But, and this is where I think the analogy holds the greatest strength, fire can also be used irresponsibly, in the same way that rhetoric can be used irresponsibly, and the damage that it causes can be far beyond what anyone ever planned to do or anticipated. So I think rhetoric is incredibly dangerous, but I don't think that the solution is to just pretend it isn't there, which is what people have been doing. And rhetoric is seen as a bad thing. Like the only time the media will talk about rhetoric is when they're trying to talk about someone who fits the narrative character trope of the villain. You know, when people are talking about North Korea, they're going to use rhetoric. But when they're talking about a popular politician in the Western world, they'll talk about oratory, even though it's the same thing in this context.
And why do they do that?
Because they use rhetoric as a derogatory term to try and vilify someone. So if they say, oh, well, that person's using rhetoric. Now, of course, that's ridiculous. It's almost impossible to say anything without using rhetoric. You know, we're using it now. I'm sure that your listeners, if they think about the last conversation they had, the last 10 seconds, you'll find some sort of rhetoric. Like, rhetoric is a core part of communication, and it's almost impossible to communicate verbally or in writing without using some sort of rhetoric. But people have sort of coined it as this sort of horrible thing that only bad people use. And even in the time, again, I'm sorry, I keep going back to Shakespeare, but I hope the listeners will be forgiving to my Shakespeare references. But even in Shakespeare, we're warned about the art of rhetoric, because in King Lear, there's a scene where Cordelia is asked to declare how much she loves her father, the king, because the king's going to split his kingdom. And he says to his three daughters, how much do you love me? And the first daughter says, I love you this much. And the second daughter says, well, I love you more than she loves you. And the third daughter, Cordelia, says, if for I want that glib and oily art to speak and purpose not. So she talks about this glib and oily art that allows you to say things you don't mean. And of course, she's talking about rhetoric. So even in Shakespearean England, you have this concept of rhetoric as being disingenuous. Then you go back to ancient Rome, you've got Cicero warning you. He says the most dangerous people are the ones who know how to use rhetoric but have no substance or meaning to what they're saying. And even today, we have people who are very good at saying things and they like the popularity that comes from it, but actually they haven't thought down the values behind the messages they're conveying. They're either riding the waves of popular opinion, because loads of people have opinions and opinions are very easy to form and move. Values are a lot harder. But I think that we live in a world where communications are based more around opinions than values. And perhaps we need to have a rhetorical foundation that works on a values-based communication. But that's a lot harder because in order to do that, you need to engage in higher level thinking. You need to have longer communications, and people are impatient.
Yeah, and becoming more and more impatient.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And more polarized. I recently reread David Murray's book, An Effort to Understand, where he talks about sort of like the polarization of discourse and how it's become either you support this or you are the enemy, which logically is a false dichotomy. And we're seeing so much polarization in discourse and conversation that's leading to more and more extreme, I'm going to use the term rhetoric here badly, rhetoric on either sides of whatever debate or discussion it is, that actually the space for critical thinking is gone. Now, of course, critical thinking and rhetoric are not two exclusively mutual things. You can use lots of rhetoric and also have a lot of critical thinking and say something very meaningful, powerful, and beneficial for society, but you can also have rhetoric without critical thinking. And if you have critical thinking with no rhetoric, no one's going to listen to you.
Yeah.
Well, probably. It's a lot harder,
Right.
a lot harder.
Right. Or less people. Yeah. And so with this book, that just came out like a week ago or so,
Yeah, I
The
think
Language
it's...
of Language of Evil, what do you hope that the readers, because they're not, unless they're listening as an audiobook, what do you hope that the readers are able to pull away and spread this message? So it's not just an individual one by one. Like when you think of maybe even that fire idea, like what do you hope
Mhm.
spreads from this?
Well, a lot of fire safety awareness, perhaps, is what I'm looking for. Don't play with it, kids. Or if you see someone juggling fire, take a step back. Don't get closer to the bright lights. I think my thinking is actually this is again, and rhetoric is something that I find I'm incredibly passionate about. I think it's such a big part of our lives, and I just find it so mind-boggling that people don't understand how it works. So I just want people to understand how it works. And I wrote this book. I've got my copy here. It's called, the subtitle is How Dictators Manipulate the Masses and Wield Power Through Words. And one of the things that I was really trying to do with it was purely historical. I've not written about anyone living, to try and say, look at what these people have done. And I'm hoping that the readers will find their own modern parallels between that, or maybe they'll just pick it up and think this is interesting as a history book. One of the things that's it got a great endorsement by Terry Suplatz, who was the foreign policy speechwriter or senior speechwriter for Barack Obama, and he said it's the handbook that humanity needs right now, which is interesting because it wasn't designed to be this is how you protect yourself, this is how you do it, but I think it would be wonderful if it could be that.
That's how you came on my radar, was through Terry.
Fantastic. Well, thank you,
Yeah.
Terry.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. If you're listening, I want you on the podcast too. Yeah, because like I was watching your TED talk where you talk about repeating these brief, concise statements and here in the conversation that hypnotic experience for the listener, like hearing it over and over and over again. I mean, I think back to speeches in all different spaces, like school or something like that resonated with me. And there was that like hypnotic feeling in the audience.
Yeah, and repetition is such a core part of communication. Like one of the things that I don't think we mentioned yet is the idea of things being structured into three parts. It's called a tricolon. But the idea that some of the most famous quotes that we have are structured into tricolons. We think a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. You've got of the people, by the people, for the people. A three-part repetition, and it's incredibly effective. Julius Caesar famously said, "I came, I saw, I conquered." And again, we've got this three-part repetition, and wherever you look, you're going to find them. The example that I use in the language of evil is I look at this concubine from Middle China, from the Tang dynasty, and it's just said that the emperor, she was a concubine to the emperor. The emperor had an unruly horse, and she said, "I will be able to tame the horse for you. I will need a carrot, a stick, and a dagger. At first, I will offer him the carrot. If that does not work, I shall offer him the stick. If that does not work, I shall offer him the knife." And you basically have this tricolon, and you're like, well, here is supposedly a concubine from Middle China, like 1,000 years ago, using a tricolon. which is the same thing that Cicero used, that the ancient Greeks used, that the Hebrews used before that, that people are now using in marketing all the time. I remember I went on a big website, and it was actually Disney World, Florida, but it was a while ago, and they've updated their website since then. But the first thing that I saw was shop, plan, play, and you had these three options, specifically three, and I was like, someone has probably paid a lot of money to come up with that shop, plan, play. But there's a tricolon there. And obviously, in religion, we've got, in Christianity, there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And we've got this tricolon. And you think, why is it the tricolons are so effective? Why do we use them so much? And there are many different theories. Some people say, it's so ingrained in our culture. But that doesn't answer why you find it in all cultures, irrespective of whether those cultures ever met. Someone once explained it to me, which I thought was a good way. They said, 3 is the minimum number of beats that you need to create a pattern. And that humans just respond better to 3. But I use another example. If you go to the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, at the entrance to the Temple of Apollo were carved the 3 Delphic maxims. There were many Delphic maxims, but these were the 3 main ones. And you're like, again, how is it possible? It's ancient Greeks, we have these Abrahamic religions, we have US presidents giving speeches about the people and the government, we have Mickey Mouse, they're all using the same very, very basic 3-part repetition. And then it's when that's combined with everything else and all the other types of repetition and all the other types of emotional tricks that rhetoric can offer, you end up with some phenomenal speeches. Some phenomenal in a good way, some phenomenal in a bad way. But it's quite mind-blowing. And when I was conducting research for this book, my publisher said to me, I want you to write a book about why rhetoric is so dangerous. You always say rhetoric is dangerous, so prove it. And I thought, I'm going to try and research some people that I know nothing about, that I've never really known. I have this queen from Madagascar called Ranavalun I. And what does this queen in Madagascar say? And I tried to research her and find it was very hard to find speeches because she hated anyone non-Malagasy. If you were white, if you were Christian, you would probably end up dead. This was in the 1800s. So very few people were around to document what she actually said. And there was one guy who kind of survived and stayed there and was quite close with her, who was a Christian missionary, but Christian under the radar kind of thing. And he wrote down some of her words, her edicts and her speeches. And again, you find that this queen of Madagascar from the 1800s, who hated everything Western, which had included classical rhetorical training, is using all of these rhetorical tropes, even though her culture is Malagasy on this island off the coast of Africa that would have had very little European influence in its culture. And she was a fascinating character historically because you don't get many female monarchs who rule in the way that she did. And in order to become the queen, she had to steamroll over the dynastic traditions, kill loads of people. And during her reign, this is genuinely horrifying, the population of Madagascar decreased from 5 million people to 2.5 million people. So she killed off 50% of her subjects, or reduced the population by. So she probably killed off more than that because of the birth rates. And so the population went down to 2.5 million. And a big part of that was through her justice reforms, because she decided that the form of justice that the country used was too Western. It was that you sit down, you listen, and then you come to a conclusion. She thought, no, we're not doing that. Let them eat poison and see what happens. So she introduced trial by ordeal, which is that, technically what you had to do is you had to eat 3 bits of chicken skin. You had to swallow 3 bits of chicken skin whole. And then you had to eat this poison made from a type of shrub you only get in Madagascar. And then if the poison killed you, you were guilty. If it didn't kill you, you would be sick. And if you were sick and all 3 bits of chicken skin were found in your vomit, you were innocent. But if only 2, 1, or 0 bits of chicken skin were found, you were guilty, and then you were killed. And you think, who is this mental queen from the 1800s who introduced these awful policies? And what kind of speeches did she give? I had to find out. So I went through all the history books until I found something, and absolutely fascinating. So I often say, if the reader of this book has as much fun reading it as I did researching it, then they'll have a blast.
Yeah, that's unbelievable that she's able to, one, as a female back in the day, take control, and then 2, manipulate people so that they buy into this philosophy of, oh yeah, okay, I'll eat that, and then that those outcomes mean that I'm guilty or innocent. Sure, that makes perfect sense.
I'm sure that lots of people were very reluctant to eat it. But I think with the upper classes, you had an option where you could get the dog to take the test for you. So the dog ate the poison. But obviously, if the dog died, you were then guilty and you would get killed. But that was only for the elite upper classes, because there was this class system as well. So, sorry?
Killed a lot of dogs then, too.
Yeah, although the history books don't tell us exactly how many dogs were killed. But yes, a lot of dogs have died as well. Probably. We never think about the innocent canine victims of these tyrannical Malagasy queens.
It's incredible. Like, oh my goodness. It's wild how much we can be influenced by somebody else's speech.
Yeah. And she gave edicts against Christianity, and she really goes all out. She tells the people, she said, thinks about your ancestry, thinks about your ancestors, think about the banners, think about, and she invokes all of this like Malagasy religious thing. And she says, everything that built our culture that we hold dear is being attacked by these Christians. And she gives these very passionate anti-Christianity edicts. And she says, basically, we can't tolerate them. We can't have them. If you're a Christian, you have to come and register yourself and declare yourself a Christian and stop being a Christian. And there's a lot of this going on. And I also tried, I didn't find quite as much, but on the note of forced conversion, a lot of the rhetoric around the Spanish Inquisition during the reign of Isabella I is very fascinating as well. And a lot of really othering the Jewish converts to Christianity. They were after they called them the pigs or donkeys, the Moranos, and they went around torturing Jews who converted to Christianity. So they told Jews, oh, you have to convert to Christianity, otherwise you'll be treated like, third-class citizens. And many Jews didn't and got treated awfully. And the ones who did treat then ended up getting tortured to make sure they were real Christians and not just Jews pretending to be Christian to exploit the system. And the guys who ran the Inquisition, awful things being said. And the declaration of when they announced that the Jews were going to be expelled from Spain, because Isabella I famously expelled all of the Jews from Spain. She wasn't the first country to do it. The first country to expel all of its Jews was actually England in, I think, 1190. But Isabella I did this, and I looked at some of Isabella I's speeches, and then I included her in the book, and then I realized that this is controversial. There are lots of people who in school have only learned of Isabella as being a really wonderful person, as a strong female monarch who had Christian values, who set up schools for orphans, which of course she did do, but then she also started the Spanish Inquisition and banished all of the Jews from Spain. And even now, today, they're debating whether or not, in the Catholic Church, whether to make her a saint, to canonize her. So there's a big push to canonize Isabella I, and then a big push back to canonizing her within the Catholic community is, oh, well, he was very anti-Semitic, so we can't canonize her. But even today, it's quite controversial. And I think some of the examples I've used in the book, people were not happy about. Someone wasn't happy that Napoleon would be in it. Obviously, if Napoleon is in a book with Hitler, it doesn't mean they were both the same type of bad. But Napoleon wasn't a good guy. Neither was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was the first person to become dictator for life in ancient Rome. So dictator was a post that would be reappointed, I think, every 3 years. And he was the first person to become dictator for life. And another one is Indira Gandhi, the former Prime Minister of India, who's in there. And she was a very controversial character. There's still many people today who believe that, well, she did what had to be done. And you're like, well, I think forcibly sterilizing, over 6 million men by grabbing them off the streets, performing this awful procedure, never has to be done. There are lots of different opinions. But one of the things that's interesting is that Indira Gandhi, and for listeners who might not know, India is a democracy. She was elected as an MP. She was then elected as the Prime Minister of India, even though her father was the Prime Minister. So there's a bit of nepotism going on there. But she was then accused of corruption. She was taken to trial. She was found guilty, and she was barred from politics, which meant she wasn't allowed to be an MP, even though she was the Prime Minister. So he carried on being Prime Minister, but not as an MP. And this legal case against her carried on mounting. So she declared a state of emergency, where she said, people are weaponizing democracy as a tool with which to attack me, your democratically elected leader. So in the name of democracy, I'm abolishing democracy. And she cancelled democracy for 21 months. And for 21 months was India's first dictator, and only one. So there's 21 months of I think it's 21, 24, but 20-something months of emergency rule. And she did horrendous things, like she tried to bring India's population down by having forced vasectomies, where people would literally, the vans would turn up into a village and they'd literally run out and grab whatever man they could find. Sometimes not even of, the right age to reproduce. They did it on young boys, 12 years old. They did it on a 75-year-old man. And they'd force these gruesome vasectomies in the back of a van with rusty equipment. And thousands of people died. Lots of people were really unhappy. It was obviously a very classist thing as well. Civil servants were refused to get their pay unless they opted to get a vasectomy. And this is all part of reducing India's population boom, because I think there's lots of pressure from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. But it's crazy that she went on the radio and gave a speech announcing that democracy is being cancelled. I said, guys, I'm stopping it. And here's why. And we've got the speech, we've got the translation of it, we've got the original audio. Obviously, I was researching the translation for my own linguistic barriers. I do not speak all the languages of the characters and historical figures in the book. But fascinating.
What is MP?
Sorry, Member of Parliament.
Oh, okay.
I'm so sorry. This is just me being British and using my So in a lots of different governments that have they'll have you have MP as member of parliament, PM is prime minister.
Yeah. This is me
But
being an idiot, so
no, 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 not
I'm
at all, not at all,
American.
not at all. Well, do you know it's funny because then you also get things like MSP, which is member of Scottish Parliament, or MEP, which is member of European Parliament. No, oh, I'm so sorry. I've just done that thing that I always tell people not to do, which is not to use jargon.
We'll
But
edit
there
it
we go.
out. We'll
We
just
can
cut that
all
part
no,
out.
no, keep it, keep it, keep it. I insist we keep it, and I'll tell you why. It's because we all need to constantly reflect on how we
Yeah.
communicate and how we can do it better.
Yeah, exactly. We can fall into our. It's like I'm a big fan of Danny Kahneman, who passed away somewhat recently and won the Pulitzer Prize, an economist at Princeton, and he talked about cognitive biases
Hmm.
and how he goes, I study these. I've been studying these for decades, and I still fall into them. I'm
Yeah,
I'm the most susceptible, right? So, because we're all human.
absolutely. To err is human, forgive divine.
That's right. So, how can we, like, we think about from the flipping the evil perspective, how can we, as, say, the layperson, the general public,
Hmm.
use these rules of rhetoric to create positive movements that persuade, influence groups of people in societies and communities, like whatever, our local community, our neighborhood, so that we're intentionally using this force for good? Like, what are some with being just, the general person who may not study it extensively, Americans who don't read. No, just kidding. But like, how can we use some of these rules, become aware of these rules, and use some of these rules for good in our everyday experience and lives?
I think that there's a chapter in my first book on logical fallacies, and I think it's really good to learn how logical fallacies work because often they're very persuasive. And when we learn what they are, we can say, well, actually, that's a logical fallacy. Perhaps we shouldn't. We mentioned the false dichotomy earlier, but so many times you can find yourself, oh well, actually, when you feel forced to think a certain way, or if you find yourself thinking a certain way that you didn't think you would think, ask yourself why. Why am I thinking this? What have they said that's got me to think that? And that process is part of the critical thinking that breaks down rhetoric, because rhetoric works most effectively when you're not using your critical thinking skills. And the whole point about rhetoric is that you overcome with emotions that the critical thinking skills go. So if you ever find yourself, really supporting a speaker, or you read something on social media and you think, wow, that's really powerful, or you see something on TikTok, ask yourself why. Why am I feeling this way? And what has the creator of this content done to make me feel that way? And what agenda might they have had? Because quite often we don't realize that there's an agenda. We'll see content on social media that will elicit a very strong response. And sometimes it will be a video with a little bit of text, or sometimes it will just be someone giving a speech, or it'll be a stand-up comedian who's taken a moment from their skit to make an important point. But outside of context, these mean nothing. These could mean anything. And the context is so important. And we're so used to consuming narratives with no context and then having a strong emotional response. But also, and I think this is a big part of it, we need to be able to realize when we're being trapped into taking a position. I think there are lots of situations where people say, well, surely you must think within this small, box. And if you don't, you are the enemy. And obviously that's a false dichotomy, almost always is the case. But then people want to jump in the box and be like, well, I'm not the enemy, I'm not the enemy. And a lot of these narratives also focus around this idea of oppressor and oppressed, which is ironically is quite Marxist. If you read the second sentence of the Communist Manifesto, it says something like, the entire history of the human race can be summarized into one word, the oppressor and the oppressed. But what people do is they have this very binary way of thinking about any issue and think, who's the oppressor, who's the oppressed? And then if you combine that thinking with a really strong cancel culture, the idea is, well, if you don't stand up for this cause or this movement or this ideology, you are therefore the oppressor. And what happens then is people feel pressured into taking a position that they haven't had the time to think about. Also, you have to realize that if something rhymes, it's not necessarily true. There's so many political slogans that people shout out that rhyme. And they think, oh, well, it rhymes, so it must be true. But one of them was like, silence is violence. And they said that if you don't speak out, you're part of the oppressive structure. Now, of course, there are cases where that is true, but what people shouldn't do is say, okay, well, silence is violence, therefore I'm going to speak out and declare something without thinking what it is that you're declaring. And that's what people are doing. So we were talking about opinions and values earlier. We live in a world where people feel forced to hold certain opinions, and they feel to speak out about those opinions, or even to take the time to think about how those opinions fit within your values can sometimes get you cancelled. And I think that's really dangerous. And I think that people need to sort of be empowered to stop and think about what they're saying, or to think, actually, maybe I shouldn't have an opinion on this, or maybe someone is trying to manipulate my mind into thinking X, Y, Z. And the antidote essentially to malicious rhetoric is, one, to understand how rhetoric works, but two, to use our own critical thinking skills. And this links back to the whole defense against the dark arts theme that I keep bringing up every now and then, every 20 minutes. We need to learn what it is so that we can protect ourselves from it, but also not to lose track of who we are, what our values are, and to always take time to think about how this communication applies to us, or to me. So maybe someone's listening to this thinking, wow, rhetoric's really important. And they'll be like, no, Guy just has an agenda to tell us rhetoric's important because he's a speechwriter. Let me think about it. And then go off, think about it. Maybe you'll forget about it. Maybe you'll think, actually, no, I agree with Guy. Or maybe you'll be like, no, this is completely wrong. And then reach out to me on LinkedIn and I'll explain to you why you're wrong. I'm joking. I'm joking, guys. I'm not like that. I'm not like that.
Yeah, it seems like there's power in the pause.
Absolutely. And again, things that rhyme are true and things that are alliterative are true. Power in the pause. No, I'm being facetious here, but it's a nice way of framing the concept. Like, the big ideas don't need big words. Power in the pause. I like it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I was 12 years old, somewhere around there. My grandmother gave me Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Are you familiar with that book?
No.
Okay, so he was, his entire family, his friends, all were murdered in the Holocaust. And he was in Auschwitz, and he was like, okay, what's the point of going on? And trying to search for a meaning to live. And in there, he writes, which many people have written about, that between stimulus and response, there's a space. And that space is the choice on what to do with it. He talks about in the book about pausing, because he has all this time. He's sitting there thinking like, okay, what's the reason for going on to live? And if he ever will get out of Auschwitz as a Holocaust survivor. And he writes this book, Man's Search for Meaning, as he started in there and gets out. And he talks about that, creating some space between those two. I think that's representative of a lot of life, especially nowadays, because in the United States especially, maybe the Western world, you could speak to this better. There's a lot of pressure to speed up, not to slow down.
Absolutely.
And I
See,
think it's
that was a very good way of saying the power of the pause, but in a way that I don't know. Maybe the listeners will agree or disagree, that I think was a lot more powerful, but exactly the same message.
yeah.
I think you're absolutely right there, Chad. I think we need to slow down. We need to think about that space, and we think about how we can respond, or what's the appropriate way to respond. I often ask people when they're particularly energetic or passionate about what they're saying. I say, especially if it's not directly related to community, say, does this cause more unity in our community or division in our community? Let's ignore the world. Let's just think about the space that we're in. Let's say this company or this school or this people in this bar. Does this story, this narrative delivered in this way, cause more unity or division? And quite often it's incredibly divisive. Like, a lot of the conversation we have are divisive because we want to be cathartic. We want to believe in a world of goodies and baddies, and that we're on the goodies and we feel good. And we define the baddies as anyone who doesn't agree with us, and then things get really, really messy. And I think part of that is that neo-Marxist binary thinking that we need to. Maybe neo-Marxist isn't the correct term. I don't want to upset anyone who knows more about this than I do, but this is just the impression I'm getting from the way that I'm seeing rhetoric being abused by polar narratives that are increasingly becoming more binary.
Yes. Well, I experienced that a few weeks ago after church. We had um, a protest education piece, and we broke off into little groups. And so it's not like in a group of 6 or 8 people. And these 2 people got into it, and they were like not even listening to each other.
Yeah.
And they were both very passionate. They were speaking quickly, and they were like, "Well, that's ridiculous. If you're going to do that, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not sitting by and this." And it was super fascinating for me to like observe, because they both wanted a similar outcome, but they were looking at it going, I'm going to take a different path to that same objective. And they were very divisive, like you're talking about, without even realizing it. They want the same endpoint, but
They have the same
they're,
values,
yeah, the
they have
same
the same
value.
value system, just a different
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. And then somebody else like it was like, okay, let's bring it back together and all right, you could do this and you could do this and you could do this and all that. But like I love what you're talking about because when we slow down, we can be more intentional. The opportunity to be intentional with our thinking and our speaking uh, can take shape. But the faster we go, I think the harder it is to be mindful or intentional about am I creating what's my motive? What's my intention? Am I creating a sense of unity here or a sense of division?
From a communications perspective, I would say that it depends if you have time, because sometimes if you're
Yeah.
writing a speech and it's for a pressing topic, it has to be delivered at exactly the right time. And if you take a few days to think about it, the ship could have sailed. And I think that there's a lot of pressure. But again, that depends. It's all context dependent. That there might be a case where speech has to be very timely, but also there's a case where it's better to wait before you share a message. Or maybe this is the right thing to say, but if we say it now, we're aware there's going to be lots of misinterpretation. So it's better to just not say it, even though we know it's the right thing to say. And I think that's what people feel people might struggle to understand, but also feel very passionately about. But it's very interesting because we look at the problems of the world and whether that's a breakdown in discourse, whether that's political polarization. Rhetoric is at play everywhere and it's used all the time. A big part of rhetoric is this idea of argumentum ad hominem. It's an argument against the person or against an individual. And we vilify people all the time. There's so much argumentum ad hominem, so much so that they say, well, if you don't say this, you are that. And then you get labeled, vilified, whatever, cancelled by an entire group of people. Like cancel culture is like the ultimate argumentum ad hominem. It's like you're part of the not cool group. We're going to attack you as an individual, and therefore we don't listen to any of your logic. But there's also a much smarter way of attacking someone's argument, which is called argumentum ad rem, which is when you attack their logic, where you sit down and you listen to what someone says, and you don't discredit them because of who they are or because of their past experiences or what they've said in the past, but you dismantle their logic. And I think a lot of argumentum ad hominem, attacking individuals, has become sensationalized, and as a result, people don't agree with it. If I'm disagreeing with someone and I start attacking their character and not what they're saying, a lot of people won't like that I'm doing that. There's actually a quote from I suppose I could call her a controversial British politician. She was both an MP and a PM. It's Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher says, when people insult me personally, I take it as a compliment because it means they haven't got a single argument left.
Hmm.
And that's how she looked at it.
That's
It's
great.
the relationship of argumentum ad hominem and argumentum ad rem.
I wish I would have had that in my mind like 2 years ago. That would have been in the workspace. That would have been beautiful.
You get some funny quotes from former prime ministers in the UK. They're very eccentric. I think one of my favourite quotes. You think about logic and argumentum ad hominem. There was Benjamin Disraeli when he was leader of the opposition. He stood up and he said, in the chamber of the British Houses of Commons, he said, "Mr. Speaker, half of this house is an ass." Now, obviously, you're not allowed to make personal insults in the Parliament. So the Speaker said, no, you're not allowed to say that. You have to withdraw your comment. And then Benjamin Disraeli stood up and said, of course, I apologise and I withdraw my comment. And then he said, Mr. Speaker, half of this house is not an ass. And he sat down. And of course, the speaker didn't know what to do because technically he didn't say anything wrong. But what he did is he used anticlasis, which is when you use something that has multiple meanings and the meaning changes in the second time you've used it. So what he did is he basically insulted everyone with this really derogatory, unparliamentary language, then reaffirmed that his side were the best. There's also a situation where someone said that something was a calamity, and Benjamin Disraeli said, no, it's just a misfortune. And someone said to him, what's the difference between a misfortune and a calamity? And the Prime Minister at the time was called Gladstone, who was like Disraeli's arch. So someone said, what's the difference between a calamity and a disaster? Sorry, between a calamity and a misfortune. And he said, well, if Gladstone were to fall into the River Thames, it would be a misfortune. If someone were to help him out, it would be a calamity.
That's great.
And there always little turns of phrases that various people use that sprinkle in a bit of humor, but also make a really strong political point, or philosophical point, or whatever it is, ideological point. It's very interesting for me to look at these things and analyze them and think, well, what exactly are they saying? Like, the Margaret Thatcher thing with when they attacked me, they haven't got a single argument left. That would have appealed very much to her voter base, who are probably sick and tired of argumentum ad hominem against her and against anyone. And quite often we will find arguments and we think, what, we're fed up with hearing these arguments. These arguments aren't what we want to hear as the public, as the shareholders, as the whatever audience we are. And we want to move away from that. But it can be it can be quite difficult to communicate that to speakers sometimes because they're scared to say something different to what is the culture of speaking today. And it can be very difficult for also CEOs even to say something radical. I was working with a CEO who said, "Oh, we have to say this." I said, "Why? Why do we have to say that?" "Well, that's what all the other CEOs say." I was like, "But do you want to be all the other CEOs? Or do you want to be the best, most powerful CEO or whatever it is?" And it's interesting because I have to work with clients and help them sort of break out of their comfort zones to communicate in a way that actually does service for what it is that their company does. And in many cases, it's quite a scary process. It's, public speaking is scary, rhetoric is scary, using it is scary. And I tell people that whenever you have an opportunity to share an idea, ideally through a speech, but through anything, but speech specifically, it's an opportunity to win the hearts and minds of the people who are listening to you. And if you're not going out there to try and win their hearts and minds, why are you doing it? Why don't you just write an email or an op-ed? Why are you doing a speech? The reason that speeches work so well is because they allow you to communicate on that emotional level. And if that's not what you're going for, maybe you need to reevaluate. Take that time to think. Power of the pause. As my good friend Chad would say.
That's right. We've become good friends over this time period. So, any closing final thoughts you want to leave with the listeners, Guy?
I think what I'd say, I'm going back to rhetoric because that's what I do. That's what my books are both about. It's the nature of all my work. Is I would like the listeners of this podcast to just be told, be aware, rhetoric is all around you. You hear it every single day. You hear it from your families, your loved ones, your friends, your colleagues. You hear it on the news, on the adverts in between the news, when you're watching Netflix, when you're on social media. We're surrounded by rhetoric. And my challenge to you, dear listener, would be see if you can spot it. Try and ask yourself, what has this person done? Why am I thinking this way? And try and maybe slow down, take a pause, and try and apply some critical thinking and see if you maybe it helps you see the world more clearly. Because I think that we do live in a world of smoke and mirrors and echo chambers, if I'm going to mix my metaphors, which I love doing. So I think it's the idea that I would like people to remember that rhetoric is absolutely everywhere. It affects all areas of our life. And if we don't bother to look for it, we're just, we're sitting ducks.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It's kind of like the parable or whatever it's called with the two fish swimming in the water, and the third fish swims by and says, "How's the water, boys?" And the swims off. That third fish swims off, and the two fish look at each other and go, "What's water?"
Yeah.
That's like rhetoric. It's all around us, and sometimes we don't even realize it, right?
Well, the thing is, people they've never studied rhetoric, but they use it. People use tricolons, they use ad hominem, but they don't know what ad hominem is. They've never studied it because it's such an innate part of our communication. In the same way that some people don't necessarily know what different word classes are, like what's the difference between adverb and adjective. You still use adverbs and adjectives. You still use fronted subordinate clauses and adverbials. You just don't know the names for them. But rhetoric, like grammar, once you study it and you understand how it works, you can then use it much more effectively. But rhetoric is way more fun than grammar. Sorry, way more fun.
Sorry,
This is
grammar.
the nerdy side of me coming out.
Oh, way to get divisive, Guy.
Yeah, so to any grammarians listening, you're wrong. No. I'm a
And
big fan of both
shame you.
rhetoric and grammar.
Shame you.
So, like you said, I could use argumentum ad rem, but I'd rather stick with argumentum ad hominem. If you're into grammar, you're boring.
That's right. That's right. You are a boring person.
And boring people don't have interesting things to say. I know. I realize the irony, people. I realize the irony.
And so your book just came out, The Language of
Yep.
Evil.
Yep.
And
I've got my copy here.
where can people get your book? And also, where do you want people to follow you, connect with you? Thoughts on that?
So my book is published by Canterbury Press, who are a fantastic London-based publishing company. It's, I think, available globally, probably online on all the big bookstores online, like Amazon and things. I don't know if it will be in US bookstores, but I know that in UK it's going to be in all major bookstores. You can get it there. It's also available as an ebook. And if you really can't find it for whatever reason, send me a connection on LinkedIn and say, I listened to that podcast, I can't find your book, do something about it. And I'll contact the publisher and I'll say, what's going on?
Right.
But no, I always tell people that if they have any questions, if they're just curious, they can always connect with me on LinkedIn and reach out. I also have a website, it's called the Cambridge Speechwriter. I have a blog that I occasionally upload with some little amusing rhetorical nuggets that may or may not be profoundly wise or phenomenally whimsical, however you choose to interpret them.
Yes, I love it. Thanks so much for sharing and coming on today. This is
Been
awesome.
an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, press stop here. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts And if you liked it, please share with a friend on social media. That goes a long way to promoting this podcast so I can continue to interview and share these conversations with fascinating people. You can follow me on social media, Chad Stoloff, and visit my website, chadstoloff.wordpress.com, for more information. I'd love it if you would leave a review to support the podcast. Thanks so much. Until next time.